Hi, it's Justin from Spalta's Sag Studio, and in this video I'm going to be building a chessboard. I'm going to start by ripping some stock to a little over 2 inches. The final dimensions will be 2 inches, however, I'll be taking this to my bench and touching everything up with the hand plane to ensure that I get a seamless glue joint. And this project is going to seem like it's really over-engineered, and that's because it is. Since people will be staring at this project for long periods of time while they play their game, any imperfection is going to stand out. I also need to be sure that I compensate for plenty of seasonal wood movement. This is going to be an heirloom piece, and the client wants to pass it on to their kids and grandkids. So to ensure that this lasts multiple lifetimes, I'll take a couple extra steps, and I'll do my best to explain those when I get there. And right here I almost had kickback, so that was absolutely terrifying, but thankfully I caught it and didn't get smacked in the face. Now I'll go ahead and label all my joints. And this is a critical step to ensure that we have proper alignment for planing, and also to make sure that we don't get jumbled when we're doing the glue up. When clamping, I want to be sure that the labeled joints are facing outward. I also want to be sure that everything is nice and flush, and I tune my hand plane to take off minimal material. Again, we're only doing this enough to smooth everything out. We don't want to remove too much material. It's really important that we keep this at 2 inches. And I'll go ahead and repeat this step for all the joints that we have so far. I actually did 3 different glue ups to glue this panel together. I started with 2 smaller ones, that way I could run them through my planer. And since my planer is only 13 inches wide, I can't fit too wide of a panel. Once I planed those down, I glued them together in a similar manner, and then I sanded everything down flat. Next up, I'll cut the pieces for what I'm going to refer to as the expansion board. Since the next glue up for the checker pattern will be end grain, and that offers very little strength, we're actually going to glue the pieces to this. That'll offer a lot more strength, and it'll also expand and contract in a similar manner to the checker pattern. Now, if we would have glued the checker pattern directly to something like plywood, we could run into some serious issues. The checker pattern is going to want to expand and contract, and at this size, it's going to be a little less than 1/8 of an inch through the seasons. The plywood, however, will not expand or contract, so we would risk it cupping and or splitting the checker pattern. Initially ripped down the pieces for the checker pattern, I cut an extra piece, and I left this aside so that way I can do test cuts to ensure that I get a perfectly square cut. Piece as a reference to set up my stop block, it still took me a couple tries to get it perfectly square. Though finally I was within 1/1000th of an inch, and I thought that was fine. Now for most projects you could probably get away with a little more tolerance on this. However, since we're gluing 8 pieces together, whatever difference we have is going to be multiplied by 8. So it's really important that we get as close as possible, that way this chessboard remains square. Remember, I did do a couple test cuts to make sure that my table sled was still square. I set this down a lot, sometimes it falls over, so there's a possibility that I knocked it out of square. So it's a good habit to build before you do projects like this, to always check and make sure that nothing's been damaged or moved on you. Everything went perfectly fine, and after alternating every other piece, we have a perfect checker pattern. Back to the expansion board, we're going to cut it to the exact size of the checker pattern going with the grain. But going against the end grain, we're going to cut it to about 1/8 inch smaller. And that's just because I want to have a little overhang for the checker pattern. That way I can apply clamping pressure. If it was the same exact size, it might not get a good clamp and you might have some gaps in your glue joints. And while the end result of this glue up was perfectly fine, everything came out square, so it wasn't bad, I could have probably built a jig to really assist in this glue up, because I did fight with it a little bit, trying to make sure everything was square. Any little bit that was off, you would have noticed in the checker pattern because the corners wouldn't have lined up. So it was really critical that everything remained perfectly square, and with all the glue, things want to slide around a little bit. So in retrospect, I should have built a jig for this. I did have a little tear out that I missed prior to the glue up. Now if I would have noticed before I glued everything together, it probably would have been a little easier to fix, but honestly, it wasn't that big of a deal. I just cleaned it up with the chisel, glued in a piece of scrap wood, and then got everything flush with the block plane. After sanding it, you can't even see it was damaged. Now I can start working on the frame of the chessboard. First, I'll start by marking some mahogany, and this final dimension will be 1/4 inch, so I'm doing a little over 1/4, that way I can take it to the planer and smooth everything out after I rip it down on the bandsaw. After removing a piece with the bandsaw, I'll take the remaining piece to the joiner, get it a nice clean edge, take it back to the bandsaw, and cut off the next piece. I'll repeat this 4 times, that way I have one for each side. And the major portion of the frame is going to be made out of walnut. So I took a nice thick 1/4 chunk of walnut and ripped it down to 2 inches wide. Could have probably done this in a single pass, but I really wanted to have nice clean cuts and no burn marks, so I elected to do it in 2 passes. Each side will be composed of the thin strip of mahogany and a piece of walnut. Now since I didn't want to do 4 separate glue ups because I really didn't have the time for it, I decided to do this all at once. However, I almost made a big mistake and forgot to put the tape in between the pieces. The glue won't adhere to the tape, so it'll prevent pieces that you don't want stuck together from sticking together. If I would have forgot the tape, these probably would have been all stuck together and I would have had to start it over. So thankfully I caught myself. While we wait for those pieces to dry, we can work on the next layer of the chessboard. This layer will be made up of 1/2 inch plywood. And in this layer is going to offer a little more stability and help make sure everything remains nice and flat through the seasons. This piece is going to be an 1/8 inch bigger both ways, and when we glue on the frame, that'll give us a 1/16 inch gap all the way around to allow for seasonal wood movement. And to be sure everything lines up perfect, I'm going to actually start from the middle and measure from that point. As we discussed earlier in the video, the pieces that we glued up are going to expand and contract throughout the year based on humidity. The plywood, however, will not. So we can't just glue that piece to this plywood. We're going to have to use fasteners. And we can't just screw it down because that still defeats the purpose. So we're going to make elongated holes, and we'll apply just enough pressure when we bolt it down to hold it flat, but still allow the wood to slide in the paths that we make. Once I get the holes drilled out, I can take it to my bench and clean everything up. It doesn't have to be pretty, but it does have to be clean so that way the bolt can slide easily where it needs to go as the wood moves. On the expansion board, this exact same way I did on the previous step, and that is I started from the center. I then drilled holes and installed threaded inserts. And for this build, I'm using 832 threaded inserts. I'm also epoxying them in, but that's not really necessary. They hold pretty well without the epoxy. Now that we got those installed, we can bolt down our piece of plywood. Now our outer bolts need to be somewhat loose. We want it tight enough to hold it flat, but we want it loose enough that when the wood expands and contracts, it'll slide in our paths. Our center bolts, however, won't move, so we can bolt those down significantly harder. And again, we don't need to make this look super pretty. We want it to be functional, but we don't need to waste a bunch of time making everything look nice because it's going to be covered up and never seen again. Next, we can shift back to the frame. Now last minute I had an idea and I decided to run an inlay in this. So I'm going to run a dado on these. That's about a 1/2 inch wide by a 1/2 inch deep. Now this is not a situation where I could have used my dado stack, but it wasn't too big of a deal just to use my flat tooth blade. I already had it installed, and doing it this way made sure that I was absolutely dead center. Next, I planed down some curly maple to about a 1/4 inch thick. I then ripped it down to slightly over a 1/2 inch. Then I'll take it to my bench, touch it with a hand plane a couple times, and ensure that I get a nice tight fit. Now this wasn't really a necessary step. You could have ripped it on your table saw and using scrap pieces of wood got it to fit just as tight as I'm doing now. But I need an excuse to use my expensive hand plane, so I'm going to do it this way. Next we're going to glue another 1/2 inch piece of plywood to the one that we bolted down. And I'm doing this because it's going to give a nice clean look, and they also want this engraved. But we need to be really careful where the glue is. We want to stay away from the outer bolts especially, because we don't want it to glue the bolt down and prevent it from moving. And this is one of the fun situations where it never seems like you have enough clamps. I have a lot of surface area that clamped down and it needs to be perfectly flat. I can't have it buckle anywhere or not glue properly, because then this isn't going to sit flat on a table. Next we can cut the frame to fit the chessboard. Now there's all kinds of methods for this. You can just measure it, but in my experience, using a marking knife and marking out the sides gives you a much more accurate miter. It would be great if everything lined up perfectly with my measurements, but that's just not realistic, so maybe I'm just not that good of a woodworker. I don't know, but the marking works perfect and my miters tend to look great from that. The first one is always the most time consuming, making sure that your miter is perfectly 45, making sure everything's nice and flush. But once you get that one done and clamped to your piece, the rest of them are just a quick mark and cut. For this glue up, we need to be really cautious. We're only gluing the frame to the plywood. And if you remember right, the plywood was an 1/8 inch bigger on both sides. That gives us a 1/16 inch gap from the frame and the checker pattern. We need to be cautious that we don't use too much glue because we don't want that squeeze out to get into that gap. That'll prevent the wood from expanding, and if it's big enough, it's going to be unsightly and really hard to clean out. And honestly, for some odd reason, this was just a terrifying part of this build because everything was just coming together so nice. I was waiting for something to happen and for the glue to squeeze out those gaps. Thankfully though, everything worked out great. I didn't have any squeeze out and everything remained nice and flush. So I can start the tedious process of sanding. My client actually ordered this for a Christmas present, and I really didn't have very much time to get this done. So unfortunately, I was really pushing my timetable, and I wasn't able to get footage of the next couple steps of the laser engraving and filling with epoxy. But it's all pretty simple stuff, so there's not much to that, and that's very personal. But again, I apologize for that. I just wasn't in the spot to take time and videotape everything. And I decided to go with a 1/4 inch round over on both sides. That way when you're looking from the side, it's nice and even. I tend to stick towards a satin finish. However, on select projects for whatever reason, gloss just sets it off. And I think this is one of those. I started with lacquer and then just buffed it to a high sheen like I did in the humidor video. Anyways, there you have it. Again, sorry that I didn't get full video of the epoxy and laser, but please like and subscribe.